Richard, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hi there.
Yes, I wanted to know, how do you reconcile the two Christmas stories? Because Luke chapter 2 explains why Joseph went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, and then it goes through after the circumcision, Mary's days of purification.
Right.
She went to the temple, and she couldn't afford a lamb, so she brought 2 doves or pigeons.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, they returned right to Galilee to Nazareth. Whereas Matthew has, just as a matter of fact, he was born in Bethlehem, and then the Magi came, and they were warned, and Joseph was warned in dream to go to Egypt, and then an angel told Joseph, return to Israel. But in verse 22, Joseph was afraid of Archelaus reigning in Judea. He was warned in a dream, so instead he went to Galilee into Nazareth. So
remember Galilee is
there's wealth, and it seems like they started out in Bethlehem in Matthew, and then in Luke they started out in Nazareth.
Sure,
so how do you reconcile all that
stuff?
Right.
Remember Galilee is a region, and Bethlehem and Nazareth is a city in the region of Galilee. It's really not, I don't think it's difficult when you understand the way ancient Near Eastern biographies were written, and this is characteristic of the Gospels. It's an ancient Near Eastern biography, all right? And when you have biographies, sometimes things are not in order. And in the case of Luke, he said, I put them in order. But in order doesn't necessarily mean there aren't gaps, okay? And so when Luke says, I've put them all together here in the first chapter, he says, seem fitting for me as well, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so you'd know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. So more than the others, you're going to get a sequential series of events in the life of Jesus. Now, there still might be some disorder, but generally speaking, they're going to be sequential. That isn't the way, characteristically, these accounts were written, especially when the biographies were meant to make a point, okay? They were meant to accomplish an end, a certain kind of goal. And there's a theological point that each of the writers is making with regards to the life of Jesus. And so they're going to take, generally speaking, different things and group them in different ways. We don't do that nowadays. That's not our style. But for us to assess the Gospels by today's standards is to be guilty of anachronism, reading a present thing into the past where it doesn't belong. All right. So one of the things that you're going to have in these situations is you're going to have some details that are left out, and you will go from one set of circumstances to another set of circumstances where in between those two sets is a third set of circumstances that another gospel identifies. And so when you put all of these things together, you get the most contiguous characterization of all of the events in question. Now, the way to understand, I think, the difference between the Lucan account and the Matthew account is actually very simple, all right? You cited all of these things that happened fairly sequentially in the life of Joseph and Mary. Jesus is born, then they go, and they have to buy the turtle dove. Why?
They're poor.
They're poor. Oh, wait a minute. What about Shadrach? No, not this. That's the wrong three.
They don't have names.
Manny, Mo, and Jack, right? The Eastern kings, right? We don't have their names. We don't even know how many there were. We think there were 3. Why do you think we think there are 3?
3 gifts.
3 gifts, which were first
gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
And and they're all like really valuable. So if Mary has to go and get turtle doves because she's poor, what do we know about the visitation of the Magi to Bethlehem to see the Christ child?
Either it happened later or they kept all those gifts in a separate account just for Jesus.
Yeah, they put it in an IRA, an educational IRA. No, they hadn't arrived yet. So when you look at the account in Matthew, it says there, and I just know from memory, but I'll go to it. It says that the Magi came to the house.
Yeah.
Okay, now my opinion is they always were in the house. They were just in the bottom, because when it says that there was no room for them in the inn, that's the I'm trying to think of the Greek word, kataluma or something like that. It means the upper room. There were no inns in Bethlehem. They didn't have a Motel 6 and a Hilton and all these things. There were no inns. You stayed with family members. But when he got there, Joseph and Mary, there was no room, there was no place for them to stay in the upper area of the house where they usually stay. They had to stay down in the bottom of the house where the animals were kept, okay? So that's the circumstance. And it says there, when the Magi came, they came to the teknon, the child, not the infant, the child. So probably what's going on here is you have Luke and that account, and it explains all of those things that happened very immediately after the birth of Jesus. And then Matthew includes details that happen afterwards that Luke doesn't include. Luke jumps from there right to Nazareth because his purpose was not to talk about these other things. It was irrelevant to Luke and his purpose that Jesus spent a couple of years or whatever with the family down in Egypt. But in Matthew, this is stated clearly, and part of the reason is because they include there the execution by the Romans of all these children. And this had prophetic significance, and Matthew is written principally to Jews. So Matthew includes that, about Rachel weeping for her children, and the numbers were probably rather small. Maybe half a dozen to a dozen children were killed. But notice the ages. What were the ages of the children that Herod had killed?
Less than 2 years.
Yes, up to 2 years.
Up to 2.
That's a lot of time. And it was based on the appearance of the star. That's what from the time they saw the star. And so what he's doing is he's just trying to, cover all his bases. Likely, Jesus was there in Bethlehem for a while before this incident happened, and they were told to go to Egypt. They were there for a few years, and then they go to the Galilee to move to Nazareth, and that's where Luke picks up the narrative. There is no contradiction. They're not two different stories. There is just another detail, more detail in Matthew that's given to the larger story that is given in Luke. It's not even contradictory. They dovetail perfectly.
In Luke 2:39, it says, when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. So you're saying, also they went to Egypt before?
Yes.
Luke 2:39?
Yes. Because he's just speaking sequentially there. What he's not communicating, and I'll tell you the reason I know this, he is not communicating that after the turtle dove incident they left.
Because it sure sounds like it. When they've done all the things according to the law.
Right.
And he talks about the law with the turtle doves and uncleanness and all that and going to the temple. That seems like he says they're doing it according to the law.
Correct. Yeah, they did that, everything. And then, and here's what I'm going to say, sometime subsequent to that, he picks up the narrative with them going back to the Galilee and to Nazareth. What we don't realize just by reading that account is there's a big event that happens in between. And incidentally, this is not unusual in the Gospels. There are other occasions where this happens as well, okay? When Jesus is cursing the fig tree. And then they see, look at the fig tree, it withered. And then Jesus gives them a message regarding the fig tree. But in the other account, we realize he does the curse, they go to town, and they come back. And when they come back, they see the fig tree is withered, and then they have this conversation. So it's not unusual in this kind of narrative to skip big sections that are not important to the writer that other writers supply. And the reason I know they didn't go right away to Nazareth right after the turtle dove incident is because Matthew tells us differently. And that's completely consistent with the way these kinds of accounts were written at the time. There's no contradiction, and it's not a separate story. There's a detail in Matthew that's a big detail that is included that Luke did not concern himself with. Luke is written more to Greeks anyway. He was a Greek. And so he's not going to talk about this detail of all these children dying that is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.